Let's focus on UDL practices today. So my presentation is let's take it outside the classroom, implementing UDL practices in non-teaching roles. So I'm delighted Trevor referenced UDL, so I'm going to go into it a lot more in this presentation and why it's important. I'll talk about the UDL course I did last year in DCU and what that involved and how that led to the application of UDL principles to an information resource in DCU Library. I'm going to go into the challenges that involved, because I think we all like hearing about the challenges, as well as the benefits that the changes brought about. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the ways the UDL guidelines changed the way I approach work and how potentially you could also include it in your work practices. So I got into UDL last year, or discovered it properly, when I was asked, to my surprise, to represent DCU Library on a university consultation group. So the group is going to be gathering current best practices in DCU around the area of universal design, and it would also be identifying gaps and initiatives where we could make improvements to the offerings that DCU currently had around UD or universal design. And this linked into a bigger project, which would be building on existing learning resources around universal design in DCU that have been built with UDL principles. So the project will be widened in scope to include all aspects of the student experience in DCU. So universal design wasn't really on my radar at the time. I'd heard about it, didn't really understand it, so I needed to find out quickly what it meant if it was going to be on a group talking about it. So I found out that universal design is the design of buildings, products and other environments to make sure that everybody has accessibility, regardless of age, ability or other factors. And then universal design for learning specifically is an approach to learning and teaching that ensures equal learning opportunities to all its learners. So its practices help them to succeed in their studies and takes all learning abilities into account. That's very nice, but I wanted to know, okay, that's nice. I want to know how this works. So I was really lucky. DCU were rolling out a universal design for learning course in DCU itself at the time. Let's just... Thank you, person at the back, for shutting the door. So the course promised to provide me with an introduction to the UDL framework, to show me how to implement it into my own work practices. It ran over 10 weeks with a commitment of 25 hours to the course. So as well as wanting to know more about UDL, I just started this job. I wanted to impress people, so I signed up. So the course is going to be delivered through 3 face-to-face workshops, asynchronous learning activities and peer group meetings, and then part of the course would involve a design or redesign of some kind of information resource or course that you're working on in the library. So our course facilitators, who included the wonderful Trevor Boland, which is why he's here today, because he was so brilliant during that course, explained that that activity would need sign-off from the facilitators, but very cleverly would also need to be signed off by people in your peer group. So we were assigned to 3 people per group, and basically they would need to look at that and sign it off. So I really liked this aspect. I really didn't know how I was going to commit 2.5 hours a week to this course, but those meetings keep you motivated because you are actually meeting human beings, you're planning to get together and meet at a certain time, you're discussing the coursework and how you understood it, and really creating an understanding of UDL together. So let's talk about our diverse learners. How is this going to apply in my role? Who are the diverse learners who are coming into the library? So those group meetings really kept me on track with the coursework, and it helped to deepen my understanding of UDL itself. So my next challenge was to figure out how I was going to apply what I'd learned about UDL to redesign an activity in the library. And the facilitators explained that we should start with small changes. So don't get overwhelmed, start with something small for this activity and then plan for bigger, more impactful ones once you really understand the framework. I did find that a lot of the course content was directed at educators and teaching roles. No shade, Trevor. And I'm in a non-teaching role, so I initially struggled to identify an activity I could redesign to illustrate my understanding of what I'd learned. But the wonderful facilitators explained that we could look at any aspect of our role that conveyed information. So you might look at the design of a promotional flyer or poster, web pages or other information resources. Which is how we started looking at the LiveWise book therapy collection. So we decided to incorporate UDL principles into the online guide that's linked to this collection. It was established in 2014 in DCU Library to support the well-being of DCU staff and students, and a project team that I was part of at the time was updating the original guide to include new titles and to update the guide generally. So it features over 340 titles, and it's a collaboration between DCU Library and the Counselling and Development Service in DCU. So what I learned on in the course about UDL framework to figure out how to improve the accessibility of this new version of the guide, I wanted to make sure that it was catering for all our different styles of our learners. So don't be afraid, this is what the UDL framework looks like. It's built around best practice principles that offer everyone equal opportunities to learn. It looks quite daunting, but it's not. The way that the course teaches it, it breaks it down into chunks and it explains how it all works together. It provides really useful guidelines that show you how you can design learning environments, content or tools that are accessible and user-friendly, and it's built around the 3 guiding principles you can see at the top. So you see multiple means of engagement, and this addresses the why of learning and aims to develop learners who are purposeful and motivated. Then multiple means of representation, the what of learning, and it explains how you can support learners to be resourceful and knowledgeable. And then finally, multiple means of action and expression, and this is the how of learning, which helps learners to be strategic and goal-directed. And then it breaks it down, like I said, into those manageable sections. So you get 9 guidelines, 3 in each of the principles, and then a further 31 checkpoints. So these were really handy because it actually gives you practical examples of how you can introduce UDL into your information resource or into your course. So the ultimate goal of the framework is to create expert learners. So it's not meant to be a checklist. You're not meant to be hitting every one of these checkpoints. You just draw out the checkpoints that are useful for you. So to apply the UDL principles and guides effectively, you need a really good understanding of your learners. So during the course, within our peer groups, we talked about the diversity of our target audience, which were DCU staff and students. So UDL emphasises that learners are all different, and the way learners learn can vary depending on age, culture, background, disability or ability. So you need to factor in the different ways people learn. Best, say if they're an international or mature student, UDL helps you consider how to support students who have dyslexia, ADD or who are autistic, and it teaches you to design for students from different socio-economic backgrounds. So learning interactions are often designed with this idea of an average student, and that average student doesn't really exist because everybody learns differently, and it meant that students who learned in a different way were being excluded. So the UDL framework teaches you how to design beyond this average student and how to avoid making unconscious decisions based on your own bias. So it says it's perfectly normal to have biases, but you need to sit back, reflect on it, acknowledge it, and then change your work practices. So to reduce potential barriers to learning, you need to give learners more opportunities to engage with and understand their learning so that they can take that knowledge and act on what they know. And the focus isn't on just gaining knowledge, but developing those really crucial soft skills that they'll bring with them into the workplace, like communication, problem solving, critical thinking and organisational skills. So you want to be providing rich, engaging learning experience so that they have those skills that they can apply to any situation. So I need to go through the framework and pull out the checkpoints which apply to the LiveWise book therapy collection. It was built using a Spring Share LibGuide, which I'd say a lot of you are familiar with. So any improvements I plan to introduce had to be supported by that platform. And then reading through the checkpoints, I was able to draw on a lot of them that would be relevant to the guide, though some obviously didn't apply. 3 of us were in the process of updating the LiveWise book therapy guide. So these are my 2 very patient colleagues who worked with me on the guide. So thank you to Mags and Barbara. And they listened to what I had learned about UDL and then why I'd like to make particular changes to the guide. I also spoke to the 2 therapists from the Counselling and Development Service and explained our plans to them and gave them an idea of what that would entail. So that was interesting because they weren't directly involved in developing the guide. They picked the titles, they picked the videos, but I'll show you how they got a little bit more involved later on. So live demonstration time. So I'm going to show you what the guide looks like. 2 years of work. so I hope you think she's as beautiful as we do. So you can see that the guide is divided into 16 main categories over here, and then within those categories, especially for the bigger section, they're divided into sub-themes that aid browsing. The original guide focused on books and ebooks only, but in the new guide you can see that we've added videos and podcasts to each category as well. Some of those features the authors from books in the guide talking about their work, or other relevant videos and podcasts. So those have all been recommended or approved by the DCU therapists we're working with on the project. So I'll be showing you the guide again later. So the addition of these resources, the podcasts, the videos, ensure that the resources in the guide, they're culturally relevant and they're appropriate for different racial, cultural, ethnic and gender groups. They help us engage staff and students who learn better using audiovisual resources and take into account the different styles of our users, offer additional support to learners from different social and cultural backgrounds. So the guidelines in this principle, multiple means of engagement, explain how you should support staff and students in persisting with their learning. So how do you keep them motivated? And that means that you help them to engage more meaningfully with the resources so they'll actually incorporate what they learn into their day-to-day lives. So we did this by adding a how-to collection. So let's go back to the guide. So in the home page, it actually teaches them how to use the books in the guide. So it talks about setting goals before you actually even look at the books in the collection. What are you trying to change? What habits are you trying to change? What about your lifestyle are you trying to change? And then write that down. And then use the Take Action tab here to actually set yourself short, long-term goals. And then the other tabs teach the students and staff how to take notes, especially points that relate to their own lives, and then reflect on those, think about how they're actually going to apply them. So then as they put their plan into action, the section of the guide encourages them to actually track their performance. So it says, be honest, we want to see failures and we want to see successes. And then share your knowledge with somebody else, whether that's talking to a friend about, say, the book you're reading, because everybody loves to hear about a book so they don't have to read it themselves. And then to share it elsewhere. So put it on social media, put it on a blog, do something, because that will help to actually deepen your learning and make you more open to engaging with the lessons from the books. So the fact that the guide was created using that SpringShare LibGuide platform was really handy, because the text can be enlarged by users and they can be read by screen readers, so that was really important. And that fits in well with that multiple means of representation principle, or the WAT of learning. So as part of this, we also made sure that the videos and podcasts all had captions available. So that benefits users who are deaf or hard of hearing, but there's so many more benefits to them. They support people with different learning needs and styles. They help second language learners understand the video content and including any potentially complex language and accents. So that's important. It helps them to decipher the accents. So we added alt text to the relevant images used in the guide, and again, that makes them more accessible to learners using screen readers. And then following feedback from my colleagues, we took out all the click here links from the guide because this didn't follow best practice for digital accessibility. So that's just an example. We replaced anything that said here, click here, with actually meaningful phrases that linked to the particular resource, which again helps people who are using screen readers. So the guidelines in this principle teach you to clarify the vocabulary to use to promote understanding across languages. So this was a big one for us. This is the one that took a lot of time, because there are 343 titles in the guide, and each of these has a short description with it. So when we were first doing the guide, before I had done the UDL course, we just drew from the promotional blurbs for the books. And these were filled with jargon, run-on sentences, confusing figures of speech. So we simplified down that language so it was suitable for users at all levels. And then we provided definitions for any, say, clinical terms or potentially unfamiliar phrases used in the guide. So here's an example of a description that we took for a particular book that had two very confusing run-on sentences and complex language. We broke those sentences down into 4 sentences and then simplified the language. So multiple means of action and expression principle, or the how of learning, teaches you that learners engage more effectively with learning interactions and information resources if they're given the opportunity to share their views about them. So we created a feedback page on the guide, really simple Google form that they can click into, and they can share their views about something they've read or something they think that we're missing and they'd like to add to the guide, or if there's something about the content and layout they'd like to change. So challenges, the juicy bit. So I started the UDL course when we were almost finished updating the guide. So we had to write pretty much all of the descriptions for the 340 books in the guide again. So like I said, it took a lot of time. So ideally, I would have done the course and then approached the guide, but that's not how life works. So we just couldn't pass up the opportunity to redesign this guide we knew was going to be in use for years to come, and that staff and students would actually be using. The course materials recommended choosing an activity that take about 12 hours from start to finish. This took a lot longer than that, but I've kind of figured, what the hey, let's do it, and we took on this guide. So when you're working with people on a project who aren't aware of the UDL framework, there is an element of winning them over. If you plan to use UDL principles, you need to explain the benefits and why you need to make the changes. There were videos we couldn't use because they didn't have captions, so things like that, you have to be really choosy about the resources that you're including. And then the use of plain language in the guide. I've never had such back and forth conversations with people in my life before. So these phrases, emotional agility, optimizing your potential, and sea change, they read really well for people who are familiar with self-help books or therapeutic talk, but they may not be obvious to everybody. So we compromised on managing emotions, enhancing your potential, and deep change. So I know librarians are guilty of it, letting go of that jargon that's really commonplace for us, but that people outside the field don't understand. So you just have to step away from that. So the guide now takes into account the diversity of DCU staff and students. The UDL principles helps them engage further with the guide. Videos and podcasts mean the guide will cater to different learning styles, people with different cultural and social backgrounds. Captions are available so that they make the guide and the resources more accessible. And then there's alt text, which helps screen readers. The how-to section of the guide helps staff and students to engage further and internalise the lessons that they learn. And then the plain language, removal of jargon, makes it more accessible. And the feedback page gives them the chance to share their views and to actually get a sense of ownership of the guide. So with my own work practices, I now have those practices in mind like a buzzing bee in my head every time I'm doing something, every time I'm sending a tweet, is there alt text in it? So if I'm designing a library web page, promotional material, it's always there. So I try to design beyond that average student to make sure that we are actually supporting everybody. I talk about UDL whenever I can, so I'm here today doing that. I've also submitted the guide as a case study on the DCU website where there's practices there to help other staff and students incorporate the principles in their own teachings. And then at the event launching the collection last week, I spoke about UDL practices, and I've also written a blog post about the project. So I don't know how else I'm going to talk about it. I think I've covered them all. So then finally, how can you apply UDL in your own libraries? So I advise everybody to take a UDL course if you can. I know we're all busy, but it's probably one of the best courses I've actually ever done. It was really amazing. And it'll open the ways that you can make your library services, expertise and resources more available. So ahead.ie provides courses, 1-shot 2-hour courses or longer courses, and they're free. So I'd say have a look at those links and sign up, especially for the longer course, because they're really popular, so they do fill up quickly, and I think they only run it once a year. So making your library more UDL friendly can be as simple as adding alt text to images you share on social media. Have a look at your website. Is the language plain and simple? Are there inaccessible PDFs that should be removed in favour of HTML documents? Can click here links be replaced with meaningful phrases? Is there an information resource in your library you can get feedback about from your staff or students? And I would just say to try and design your library resources and training sessions so they take the diversity of your staff and your students into account. Focus on potential barriers for yourself or the students and figure out ways you can remove or reduce those. So the improvements don't have to involve a sweeping change. The +1 approach, as Trevor said, is the way to go. Those small, achievable improvements that show you're thinking beyond the idea of the average student. So the important thing is that you're doing something to improve the learning experience of your users and not just thinking or talking about it. So that's it. Thank you.